You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the second of our two episodes, devoted to Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, as we interview its editor, Daniel Wright. In part one, we discussed Dickens and his times, his family and his education, and the structure and themes of this 1861 masterpiece. In this second episode, we talk more with Daniel Wright about his experiences with Dickens and this novel, the way it has been adapted, his favorite lines in the novel, how he teaches it, his Norton Library podcast hot take, and much more. Daniel Wright is an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto. He is the author of The Grounds of the Novel and Bad Logic. We're thrilled he's with us again today. Daniel Wright, welcome back to the Norton Library podcast.
It's great to be back.
Daniel, I'm holding the beautiful new edition of Charles Dickens's Great Expectations from the Norton Library. Is there any reaction you have to the color scheme, which is always so striking in this series?
I was delighted when I saw these colors that they chose. They're beautiful. I'm not privy to the knowledge about how they chose the colors, but my own sense is that they're rich colors.
Like a deep purple and gold.
These are the colors of money and wealth. And This is a novel about money and wealth in a lot of ways.
Our great producer, Michael Von Cannon, went to LSU. So these are the LSU colors. So automatically, this is Michael Von Cannon's favorite edition of the Norton Library. But so, no, it's absolutely beautiful. And your edition is great. Do you remember when you first read Great Expectations?
I do, and it was one of the first things that came to mind when I was asked to do this edition. It felt like such a full circle moment. It was the first Victorian novel I ever read in high school, 11th grade English class, grade 11 as we call it here in Canada. Shout out to Priscilla Costello, my English teacher who assigned this novel to me. And so, yeah, it introduced me to the Victorian novel at that young age. And my main memory is of having to do vocabulary assignments, finding unfamiliar words and looking them up in the dictionary. And there are plenty.
I was going to say, there are probably lots of them. And you responded to it at that age.
Yeah, I loved it. It took me a long time, I think, to come back around to the Victorian novel in my own life. When I started, my career as an academic, I was more focused on the 20th century novel, but then the Victorian novel pulled me back in.
Well, high school curriculum, sometimes it's advantageous to have coming of age stories because we're all coming of age when we're in high school. And I mean, wouldn't you characterize this as Bildungsroman or Pip's coming of age?
Absolutely, yeah. It's sort of one of the classics, one of the templates of this form of the 19th century Bildungsroman, where especially because we're following Pip really from a very young age, from childhood all the way through into young adulthood. It's a novel about Pip's development where, we can debate whether Pip actually develops all that much. It's one of the things I talk about in my introduction, that even as a narrator looking back on his own life, Pip sometimes sort of says, I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what I wanted or felt. He still is sort of opaque to himself in some ways, but we as readers can sort of figure out where we think he grows and changes.
So after your initial exposure to Great Expectations, did you go on to read other Dickens or the rest of Dickens?
No. I went on to read whatever was assigned to me next.
Which is usually A Tale of Two Cities, right? That's commonly assigned.
In my high school, no, for whatever reason. It was just Great Expectations.
What are challenges to reading this novel if we're new readers to Dickens or Great Expectations?
It's long. And by the way, this is one of the short ones when it comes to Victorian novels, but it's over 500 pages. And I think that's the thing that gets people when they want to dive into a Victorian novel. They pick it up and it's this big brick. And I think that's where I often, talk to my students, especially about how this novel would have been consumed in the 19th century in installments that were released weekly. And there's an obvious comparison to our own version of long serialized
Yeah.
narratives, which is TV series. As with our relationship to TV, this was a similar way that the Victorians could relate to these serialized novels, which was you could read them as they came out, installment by installment, and wait a week for the next, bit to come out. Or you could kind of wait till the whole thing was out in book form and do the binge read, which is now kind of our main way of consuming these novels is in the binge read version. But one can choose to do the other version where you read a couple chapters each week and do it as they would have done it in the 1860s.
So how lengthy were the installments? Was it chapter by chapter? And did Dickens strategize about making plot points conditional on when he was ending it for that week?
Yeah, in this case, because the serialization was weekly, the installments are relatively short. Each one is usually one or two chapters. Most of Dickens's novels were published in monthly installments, which would have been longer. His choice to release it in weekly installments was partly because he wanted to publish it in his own magazine all the year round, of which he was the publisher and the editor. He was really trying to save his magazine, which had run into some problems because they were serializing a novel that readers were finding boring and they were not buying the next issue to find out what happened. So yeah, he was very intentional about wanting this plot to be filled with suspense because he was understanding that as the shortcoming of the novel Charles Lever's A Day's Ride that was being serialized in the magazine and that was causing readers to kind of drop off. So he was like, I'm going to come in with my novel and it's going to be a banger. It's going to be filled with suspense. It's going to get people coming back to buy the next issue. So he's absolutely interested in those cliffhangers at the end of installments.
So like, as you say, like cliffhangers, like the way a TV show would end in a cliffhanger to get you tuning in the next week.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Dickens was particularly skilled or attuned to this type of drama because, as your introduction says, he keeps you reading almost like addictively or voraciously.
Yeah, and there's another kind of historical context for that, which is the advent of what is called the sensation novel in the late 1850s and into the early 1860s. Dickens's friend Wilkie Collins is one of the great kind of innovators of this genre. It's basically Victorian thriller novels that. And there's a whole discourse happening in this moment about sensation novels as addictive and for some people that's like bad, that they make you read in this sort of edgy, nervous way, where your appetite for the novel is sort of somehow problematic. And that Great Expectations in some ways was received at the time as Dickens's sort of contribution to this emerging genre because it seems so focused on this kind of thriller suspense aspect.
Do you have a favorite line in Great Expectations?
I have two. One comes from Joe, and it's connected to the heartbreaking nature of Joe that we talked about last time. When Joe goes to visit Pip in London, and it's this painfully awkward meeting where Joe is sort of trying to be a little bit more proper and speak in this polite way, and Pip is making him feel completely inadequate, and they both realize like we might need to diverge at this point. Like this isn't working out. And Joe, as he takes his leave of Pip, says to him, "Life is made of ever so many partings welded together." It makes me cry every time. It's just heart-wrenching, and I think it again partly comes from our own sense that like Pip doesn't deserve such a beautiful goodbye in this moment, but that Joe's kindness is such that he just wants to reassure Pip and maybe even reassure himself, right? That we can make something good out of the pain of this parting. This is what life is. It's and then at the end of the novel, there's this kind of echo that comes back. Another one that always kind of breaks my heart is Estella saying to Pip at the end of the novel, "I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape." And there's this interest in the novel in what we would now call post-traumatic growth. This idea that even what is most painful, even what bends us, breaks us, hurts us, can be the material for a renewed or reshaped kind of a future. And so I think that's part of why those lines connect in such a powerful way. They speak to something that I think we still grapple with now.
Those are wonderful. And both of those characters seem like at those points, they come to a moment of wisdom that they share. It's just absolutely beautiful. I'm really glad you chose those. When you teach Great Expectations, how do you go about it?
It's a really fun novel to teach. I really love teaching the ending, that's such a good exercise to go through with students. The published ending of this novel is different than the one that Dickens originally wrote, and he was convinced to change it by some of his friends. And so it provides a really great occasion for just thinking about endings and comparing these two endings with students and thinking about how this change to the ending recasts our sense of what everything that came before means. In Dickens's original ending, for example, Estella has had a son. She's now a mother. How does that shift our whole reading of Estella as a character versus the published ending in which there's no child? So it's a great exercise to be able to think about narrative structure and what endings do to our sense of what a novel means.
Do you find that Dickens's language from 1861 is accessible to students?
No. This is one of the challenges, I think, of teaching Victorian novels. And more, I think, as time goes on, the language of the 19th century can feel more and more foreign. There are just differences in what words mean. In Dickens, he's very fond of sort of contemporary references that his readers would have gotten immediately, but that we need, Norton Library edition to help us navigate. Yeah, so we have some annotation here that helps with those. So yeah, I always, as my high school English teacher did, I always encourage students to just kind of like read with, I want to say a dictionary in hand, but probably a phone in hand with dictionary.com opened up. But I think, aside from those issues, I think the language is accessible in the sense of, even those lines we were just discussing, there's such beauty and kind of timelessness to the things that Dickens is describing that helps us.
And Dickens also writes where he's trying to render dialogue in the way that it sounds. And so sometimes you have to kind of catch the rhythm of how people speak.
Yes, and particularly Joe, who Dickens represents his dialect in this kind of phonetic way. And if you don't know the accent, you find yourself struggling sometimes. But even when I read aloud passages in Joe's voice to students, I just actually eliminate that dialect. I don't want to be like trying to perform it on stage. And I often just tell them, like, this is what you can do in your reading too, is just read the words that are kind of behind the dialect. And that helps.
We also ask our Norton Library editors for their hot take. Is there something about Great Expectations that you read one way that seems to be against the conventional wisdom?
We touched on this a little bit in the last episode. My hot take is that Great Expectations is not a love story. I think among academic readers of the novel, that won't be a hot take. I think that idea has lost its kind of stranglehold a little bit among scholars of the novel. But I think when people approach this novel for the first time, or what they know about it, what they've heard about it, it's often sort of represented as this great story of unrequited love that finally ends with a happy ending. And so, but I just don't read it that way. I really do read Pip and Estella's relationship. It's sort of what we might call trauma bonding. That these are two sort of individuals who have been deeply damaged and who find a kind of profound connection through that damage, but that their relationship is really never about love in the traditional sense.
With respect to that reading, how does Miss Havisham get incorporated? Is she traumatized, like genuinely traumatized from her own unrequited love and her own past?
Yeah, and as a result, she destroys Estella's humanity. I mean, I think this is the part where, even though the novel in some ways represents Estella as this cruel and heartless character, it's Estella who tells us, I am cruel, I am heartless, I am empty. It's not that this is an objective fact about Estella's personality, but the way that she represents herself to others, the way that Miss Havisham has taught her to see herself, because Miss Havisham wants her to be nothing more than a kind of weapon against men. So yeah, Miss Havisham is both traumatized herself and the source of Estella's own sort of warped existence. It's that thing that we always say now: hurt people hurt people.
There's that episode where Pip uses the wrong term for playing cards. He calls them jacks, and he's supposed to call them knaves. Do I have that right? He's revealed his upbringing, his lack of education based on this one term. And is Dickens meaning for us to say, why would Pip care about that? Why can't he just say, I don't care if you make fun of me about something so stupid? Or does Dickens expect us to understand why Pip wants to be included and wants to be elevated over his normal? Like, do we hold Pip at fault for that impulse?
Well, the way that Pip describes that whole scene, his first meeting with Estella, and all of these different ways in which she shames him, he says the wrong word, his boots are too kind of heavy or whatever, his hands are coarse. He describes it as, it was like I caught a kind of contagion, right? Shame is like this germ that Estella passes to him, and then once he's caught it, he sort of can't get rid of it. He begins to see himself through her eyes. And he says, suddenly, like, my body itself was like vulgar appendages, he says. And so I think that's part of it. Like, certainly, again, this is one of those moments we wish we could go in and kind of shake Pip and say, it's okay, just be yourself. But yeah, he sees himself through Estella's eyes and can no longer see himself clearly after this moment. That's what shame does, I think, right? It sort of erases our ability to understand ourselves clearly.
How has Great Expectations been adapted, reappropriated over the years? Are there other ways to appreciate this story besides the novel itself?
Yeah, there are plentiful film adaptations of this novel. And some by some great directors. There's an amazing David Lean adaptation from the 1940s. Alfonso Cuarón's adaptation from 1998, which transposes it into a contemporary setting. Pip is now Finn, and he's like part of the New York art world in the 1990s. Not Cuarón's most celebrated movie. Doesn't have a great critical reputation. I kind of love it. There's a South Park episode.
Is that the one with Ethan Hawke and Gwyneth Paltrow and Robert De Niro?
Yes.
And Anne Bancroft as Miss Havisham.
Anne Bancroft as Miss Havisham. I mean, just in the 21st century already, there have been 2 BBC miniseries adaptations. One with Gillian Anderson as Miss Havisham, one with Olivia Colman as Miss Havisham. There's, Eddie Izzard just a few years ago did a one-woman show with her playing all the characters that was on the West End in London. There's a Hindi language adaptation of this novel called Fitur that takes place in Kashmir and Delhi. So it's a novel that's been adapted in all kinds of ways in different settings and periods.
Am I mistaken, or do I remember seeing Helena Bonham Carter as Miss Havisham in one of those adaptations? Is there one?
Yes, yeah. Then that's also not that long ago, from about 10 years ago. It's very close to one of those BBC miniseries. Yeah, this is a beloved one that gets adapted again and again.
You think that it comes alive with these adaptations? You get something out of the story by seeing it, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because the themes that we've been talking about, shame, class, erotic obsession, trauma, these are, to use a cliched but I think accurate term, they're timeless themes. And so I think that there's this capacity for this novel to fit into a lot of different, to be reimagined, in the New York in the 90s or in Kashmir, or that those themes can sort of still somehow survive even with that transposition.
Is there anything else? Any plays or operas, musicals, or are we sticking to the movies?
Yeah, I'm sticking to the movies, but I don't know much about the theatrical adaptations of it. I imagine that I should say Dickens himself was famous for performing readings of his own novels as kind of like a one-man show. Some of his most popular and famous ones were not from this novel, and I doubt he would have had time to incorporate this novel because it's late in his career. I don't know whether he ever incorporated it into his repertoire, but he was known for performing his own novels.
He had achieved sufficient fame that people were looking for public performances of his novels. Do you know which novels he would perform the most?
The pièce de résistance of these readings was a scene from Oliver Twist, Nancy's death scene in Oliver Twist. This was the one that he performed most frequently and people report that it was just, heartbreaking, moving. It was really physically demanding. I mean, this is one of the things that Dickens dies of a stroke at the age of
Oh,
58.
wow.
And one of the, I think, real, even when he's in poor health, he keeps up this really demanding schedule of touring around, giving readings from his novels.
Just one quick follow up, because I don't think we touched on it when we covered his biography in the first episode. How was Dickens temperamentally?
It's a great question. I think, he's a bit of a mysterious person in many ways. Incredibly busy. You just get reading his letters is such a pleasure because you just get the sense of what a busy and full life he lived with so many different aspects to his life. But also, there's a dark side to Dickens, and it's sort of right in the background of this novel. Just before he uh, wrote it, he abruptly separates from his wife of over 20 years at that point, mother of his 10 children, and takes up a relationship with this actress Nellie Turner, who's 27 years younger than him. And this is a part of Dickens's biography that's been the fodder for a lot of writing, and there's like a film adaptation that focuses closely on that part of his life. So there is this kind of dark side to Dickens that I think also comes through in this novel, right? Thinking about what it means to desire somebody against all sense and reason, which is maybe himself processing his own relationship with Nellie Turner.
How about music? Does Great Expectations make you think of any particular music? Is there a Great Expectations playlist that you would recommend?
This is maybe my own idiosyncratic answer to this
Excellent.
question because, I've talked about the Alfonso Cuarón movie adaptation in 1998. I was 15 years old when that movie came out. You can do the math there. And the soundtrack to that film is in its own way an
Oh, is
important
that right?
cultural object of 1998. Yeah, it's a kind of like just representative sample of all of the kind of indie artists of 1998. It's like Tori Amos and Pulp and Chris Cornell and etc. And so for me, that's my Great Expectations playlist. Is just put on the soundtrack to the Alfonso Cuarón movie. It's an amazing
Oh,
album.
that's excellent. We'll have to check that out. You mentioned earlier in answering some of these questions about the dual endings. It's hard to imagine Dickens being, at this stage of his career, Dickens being influenced by any external pressures. Can you walk us through kind of the publication history about those dual endings?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that Dickens actually was famously receptive to, sensitive to reader reactions to his novels. So because they were published serially, he would, be hearing from readers while the novel was still coming out, and we know that he would often kind of incorporate that feedback and as he continued. In this case, yeah, he had the ending ready to go. Um, and it was his friend, also a great 19th century novelist, Edward Bulwer Lytton, who really urged him to revise the ending. In the original ending that Dickens wrote, it's this very brief scene where Pip and Estella encounter each other many years later. He finds out that she's been married to this very kind of cruel man who has since died. She has a son who is named Pip, and they just have he runs into her on the street and they kind of have a nice little moment together and then they go their separate ways. And so it's very clear in that ending that there's no marriage, no ongoing relationship in the cards for Pip and Estella. And I think that, the advice that Dickens got is this is too much of a departure from the traditional expectation of Victorian readers, which was that the novel has to end, if not in a marriage, at least with the hint of maybe a marriage coming. So he revises and we get the ending that we have now, where we definitely don't get an engagement or a marriage at the end of the novel, but the ending is ambiguous enough that it allows us to kind of imagine that that's where Pip and Estella might be headed, possibly.
Did Dickens get it right ultimately?
This is an
I'm
age-old
sure.
debate,
Yeah.
and again, it's fun to debate it with my students. George Bernard Shaw, the great 19th, 20th century playwright, produced his own edition of the novel that ends with Dickens's original ending because he felt so passionately that Dickens had gotten it right the first time and that he shouldn't have listened to those friends. So I think there's always been a contingent who feels passionately that the original ending was superior. Yeah, and in some ways I agree. I think, there's something about going with your gut and feeling, that you got it right the first time.
Your introduction highlights the themes of shame and pride. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more about it, about those ideas and how those ideas interrelate.
Yeah. The idea that this is a novel about shame, yeah, I can't take credit for that. That's an age old, I mean, and it's just so there in the novel, right? It's one of the great nuanced explorations of shame and how it shapes a life, warps a life. Um, but I think introducing that complementary idea of pride was what was important to me. And really, I take that idea from the great literary theorist Eve Sedgwick in her own writing on shame. She talks about how shame and pride are these sort of complementary opposites. Um, and it especially provided me a way to bring Joe into that picture of how we make sense of Pip's shame and his relationship to Joe. Joe is also a character who's sort of defined by shame. He's shamed by Pip, uh, made to feel inadequate, made to feel not good enough. But Joe's response to that shame, we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Isn't there another way to respond to just say, I'm fine just as I am? And that is kind of Joe's response. His response is a response of pride. I want to fill my position in life proudly. I sort of know where I belong, and I'm happy and proud about that. And it's only you suggesting to me that there is something wrong with it that has the potential to sort of, for that contagion of shame to, for me to catch it. So I think looking to Joe as this sort of counterpoint of a different version of what shame might look like is important.
So Joe is self-assured enough that when somebody is attempting to shame him, even somebody he loves very much, he recognizes it and doesn't really waver in his knowledge of who he is, or does he feel hidden hurt from Pip's behavior?
Clearly, he feels some hidden hurt because, in that painful scene we talked about earlier, where he's trying desperately to act as the gentleman he thinks Pip wants him to be. So there is absolutely this feeling of, you know, I'm not good enough. I want to be what you want me to be. So it's not to suggest that, Joe is unaffected by shame or that he's just perfectly comfortable in his own skin. Pride in itself can also be a kind of difficult and disabling feeling, right? Because in saying I don't want to move beyond the position that I fill, we might also say that that makes Joe kind of immune to change and development. Maybe that's the part, again, where you can be bent and broken into a better shape, that shame is such a universal part of all of our experiences, but it's also sometimes paradoxically a thing that helps us to grow and change and develop.
There's that extraordinary episode where Pip is seriously ill, and Dickens, in what might be the greatest writing in the book, takes us through these kinds of fever dreams, delirium, as anybody would know who's been seriously sick. And the only constant is that it keeps all of the images that he sees. Joe maintains his vigil, and Joe is a constant in Pip's tortured consciousness, and that is such a powerful moment.
Yeah, there's this kind of competition I think that the novel sets up between Joe and Estella as which one will be the sort of reigning image, as you're describing, in Pip's mind, the beacon for him. Because earlier in the novel, when he sort of is completely obsessed with Estella, it's Estella's image that he keeps seeing. He says, I saw her in the flames of, in the blacksmith forge. And it was as if she's always watching me. And so that later scene, it's almost this beautiful corrective to that, where now Joe has sort of taken her place as the image that keeps recurring in his mind as the one constant.
Yeah, that's great. You were mentioning earlier about some of the challenges that new students or new readers to Great Expectations might have. Do you stress any of the contemporary relevance of a book that was written 165 years ago to today, and what Dickens may be talking to readers in 2026?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I, in some ways, do the opposite, at least as a starting point, where when I teach both Great Expectations or any Victorian novel, I like the approach where we allow Victorian novels to be Victorian in all of the weirdness of that and the historical distance that comes with that. And I do talk to my students about that frequently. I don't think it precludes the novel having all kinds of contemporary relevance to us. And I sort of tell them, like, through the historical distance, through the strangeness and alienation that can sometimes produce, you're entering into this very different world that's defined in some ways by different values, but certainly be open to the parts of the human experience that are there in the novel that we can connect with, like all the things we've been talking about. But also, like, part of the reason we read this novel today is different than what people were doing when they read it in the 1860s. Part of what draws us to reading a Victorian novel is to encounter that historical distance, to like learn a little bit about what it was like to live in a different place and time. So allowing that to remain kind of alive and not an obstacle, but a part of the reason for going to a 19th century novel.
Daniel Wright, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast. It's been a pleasure, Daniel.
Thanks. It's been a great pleasure for me too.
The Norton Library edition of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, edited by Daniel Wright, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.